You need to understand this because when a true giver is hurt by someone who cannot meet them emotionally, the pain does not begin with anger. It begins with confusion, and that confusion slowly turns inward, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day they are no longer questioning the other person, they are questioning themselves. And that is where the real damage happens, not in what was done to them, but in what they start believing about who they are. Because a true giver does not love halfway. They do not calculate effort. They do not hold back pieces of themselves waiting for proof. They show up fully, openly, honestly, and when that kind of love is met with distance, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability, it creates a kind of dissonance that the heart struggles to make sense of. They start asking questions they never thought they would ask, not because they lack self-worth, but because they are trying to understand why something so real on their side feels so uncertain on the other. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to internalize that uncertainty. They start wondering if they are too much, too emotional, too expressive, too available. They replay conversations in their mind, searching for the moment they messed it up, the moment they said too much or asked for too much or felt too deeply. They begin to edit themselves, to soften their tone, to hide their needs, to become a quieter version of who they are, not because that is who they want to be, but because they believe that maybe, just maybe, if they become easier to handle, they will finally be chosen consistently. And this is the part that breaks something deep inside them, because a true giver is not used to doubting their love. Their love has always been their strength, their ability to care, to show up, to give without fear. That has always been the thing that made them feel powerful, connected, alive. But now in this dynamic, that very same quality starts to feel like a weakness. It starts to feel like the reason they are being left behind, overlooked, taken for granted. And so they begin to question the very thing that once defined them. You need to understand how painful that is, because it is not just heartbreak, it is identity confusion. It is the slow erosion of self-trust. It is looking at your own heart and wondering if it is the problem. It is thinking that maybe you should love less, feel less, expect less, just to keep someone from pulling away. And the tragedy in that is they are not actually too much. They are simply too real for someone who is not ready to meet them at that depth. But the mind does not see it that way at first. The mind tries to protect by finding answers, and when the other person is inconsistent, unclear, or emotionally distant, the only place left to search for answers is within. So they take responsibility for things that were never theirs to carry. They blame themselves for someone else's inability to show up. They assume that if something feels off, it must be because they are not enough in some way. And that belief, once it takes root, becomes heavy. It shows up in the way they hesitate before expressing themselves, in the way they second-guess their instincts, in the way they start asking for less than what they truly need. It shows up in the way they accept silence when they deserve communication, in the way they tolerate distance when they crave closeness, in the way they convince themselves that this is just how it is, even when their heart is quietly breaking. And yet, beneath all of that doubt, there is still a part of them that knows the truth, a quiet voice that says, this is not what love is supposed to feel like. This is not what it means to be valued. This is not what it feels like to be chosen. But that voice is often drowned out by hope, by the belief that things will change, that the person will come around, that all the patience and understanding will eventually be rewarded. So they stay longer than they should. They give more than they receive. They hold on to moments of warmth as proof that something real exists, even when those moments are rare and inconsistent. And every time they do this, every time they override their own truth to protect the connection, they move a little further away from themselves. But here is what you need to understand, and you need to hold on to this because it will change everything. The problem was never that they were too much. The problem was that they were giving their everything to someone who was only offering fragments. Their love was not the issue, their depth was not the issue, their willingness to show up was not the issue. The issue was that they were pouring into a space that could not hold what they were giving. And the moment this realization begins to settle in, something starts to shift, slowly, gently, but powerfully. They begin to see that their worth was never defined by how someone else responded to them. They begin to understand that being misunderstood does not make them unworthy, that being unappreciated does not make them unvaluable, that being hurt does not mean they deserved the pain. And in that understanding, they start to come back to themselves. They start to reclaim the parts they had hidden, the parts they had softened, the parts they had silenced. They start to trust their feelings again, to honor their needs again, to believe in their love again, not as something to give away endlessly, but as something to protect, something to share with someone who can meet it, hold it, and return it with the same depth. Because a true giver was never meant to shrink to be loved, they were meant to be met. And the moment they stop questioning their worth and start recognizing their value, everything changes. Not because the pain disappears instantly, but because they no longer carry it as proof that something is wrong with them. They carry it as proof that they gave genuinely, and now they are ready to receive the same in return. You need to understand this because not all pain is created with intention, and not every person who hurts you sets out to break your heart. But that does not make the damage any less real, and it does not make your confusion any less valid. When you are a true giver, you often look for reasons to excuse someone's behavior. You tell yourself they are overwhelmed, they are scared, they have been hurt before, and while some of that may be true, it does not change the way their distance makes you feel. It does not erase the emptiness that grows when their presence becomes inconsistent, unpredictable, and emotionally unavailable. Because the truth is, an avoidant does not always hurt you with harsh words or obvious rejection. They hurt you in quieter ways, ways that are harder to explain, harder to point to, harder to defend. They pull away just when things start to feel close. They go silent when you need reassurance. They give you just enough warmth to keep you there, but never enough consistency to make you feel secure. And this creates something incredibly painful. Something that lives in the space between hope and doubt, where you are never fully held, but never fully released either. You need to understand how deeply this affects a true giver, because a giver does not operate from fear, they operate from connection. They believe in showing up, in communicating, in building something real. So when they are faced with someone who avoids emotional closeness, it creates a clash of energies. The giver leans in, trying to fix, to understand, to support, while the avoidant leans out, trying to protect themselves, to create space, to escape intensity. And in that push and pull, the giver is the one who feels the weight of inconsistency the most. At first, they try to be patient. They tell themselves that love requires understanding, that not everyone expresses emotions the same way, that maybe if they just give it time, things will balance out. But over time, patience starts to feel like waiting, and waiting starts to feel like neglect. They begin to notice patterns, the delayed replies, the emotional distance, the way conversations never go deep for too long, the way vulnerability is met with withdrawal instead of closeness. And still, they try to adapt because that is what givers do. They adjust themselves in the hope of preserving the connection. But here is where it starts to hurt in a way that is difficult to explain, because the avoidance behavior creates emotional confusion. One day, they are warm, attentive, present, and it feels real. It feels like everything the giver hoped for. And then suddenly, without warning, they pull back, they become distant, unavailable, detached. And the giver is left trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what changed, what went wrong, what they did differently. And most of the time the answer is nothing, but the giver does not know that, so they assume it must be them. This kind of inconsistency does something powerful to the mind. It creates a loop, where the giver becomes focused on restoring the connection instead of questioning it. They start chasing clarity, not because they are needy, but because the situation itself is unclear. They want stability, they want to feel grounded, they want to know where they stand, but instead of receiving that clarity, they receive mixed signals. Moments of closeness followed by distance, attention followed by silence, affection followed by absence. And that cycle slowly wears them down. You need to understand that this is not just about missing someone. It is about losing a sense of emotional safety. It is about waking up and not knowing what version of the relationship you are going to get that day. It is about feeling like you have to be careful, like you have to say the right thing, not too much, not too little, just enough to keep them from pulling away. And in trying to maintain that balance, the giver starts to lose their natural way of loving. They stop being free, they stop being open, they start being cautious. And the most painful part is, the avoidant may not even realize the impact they are having. To them, creating space feels necessary. It feels like protection, like survival. They are not always thinking about how their silence echoes in someone else's heart, how their distance feels like rejection, how their inconsistency creates anxiety. They are focused on managing their own discomfort, their own fear of closeness, their own need for control. And while that may explain their behavior, it does not justify the pain it causes, because the giver is left holding something that does not make sense, something that feels real but unstable, something that offers connection but never security. And over time, that creates emotional exhaustion, not the kind that comes from one big heartbreak, but the kind that builds slowly, from repeated disappointment, from unanswered questions, from the constant effort to keep something alive that feels like it is slipping away. And still, the giver stays longer than they should, not because they are weak, but because they believe in the potential of what could be. They see glimpses of who the person can be. They hold on to the good moments. They convince themselves that those moments are the truth and everything else is just temporary. But eventually reality becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually the pattern becomes too clear. Eventually the emotional cost becomes too high. And that is when something shifts, not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply. The giver begins to see that love should not feel like constant uncertainty. They begin to understand that connection should not come with confusion. They begin to realize that being patient with someone else should not mean being neglectful of themselves. And in that realization, they start to pull their energy back, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because at the end of the day, you can understand someone's pain, you can empathize with their fear, you can care about their struggles, but you cannot sacrifice your own emotional well-being to accommodate their inability to show up. And that is the truth that changes everything. The moment you realize that someone can have reasons for their behavior and still not be right for you. You need to understand this, because the moment a true giver stops overgiving and begins to choose themselves, it does not look dramatic from the outside. It does not come with loud announcements or long explanations. But inside, it is one of the most powerful shifts a person can experience. It is the moment where something deep within finally says, I cannot keep abandoning myself just to keep someone else comfortable. And that realization, as quiet as it may seem, carries the weight of every time they stayed when it hurt, every time they gave when they were empty, every time they chose someone else over their own peace. For a long time, a true giver does not even realize they are overgiving. To them, it feels like love. It feels natural to care, to show up, to be present even when the other person is inconsistent. They do not count effort. They do not measure who gave more. They simply give because that is who they are. But over time, when that giving is not met with the same energy, when it is not reciprocated with consistency and care, it begins to take a toll. It begins to feel heavy. It begins to feel one-sided. And slowly, the giver starts to feel something they are not used to feeling, drained. You need to understand how confusing that is for them, because they are not used to associating love with exhaustion. They are used to love feeling warm, safe, fulfilling, but now love feels like effort, like work, like something they have to constantly maintain on their own. They find themselves thinking more than they feel, analyzing more than they enjoy, questioning more than they trust. And that is when the shift begins. Not because they want it to, but because they can no longer ignore the truth of what they are experiencing. The truth is, overgiving often comes from a place of hope. Hope that if they just give a little more, the other person will meet them. Hope that their consistency will inspire consistency. Hope that their love will create safety for someone who struggles with closeness. But hope, when it is not grounded in reality, can become a trap. It keeps the giver invested in something that is not growing. It keeps them attached to potential instead of accepting what is actually being offered. And eventually, that hope starts to fade. Not because they stop caring, but because they start seeing clearly. And clarity changes everything. Because once a giver sees the pattern, once they recognize that they are the one holding everything together, they cannot unsee it. They begin to notice the imbalance in ways they ignored before. They see how often they initiate, how often they adjust, how often they excuse behavior that does not feel right. And with that awareness comes a quiet discomfort, a feeling that something needs to change. At first, that change feels unfamiliar. It feels wrong to pull back, to stop reaching out, to stop filling the silence. It feels like they are doing something bad, something unkind, because they have spent so long believing that love means always being there, no matter what. But what they are learning, slowly and painfully, is that love without boundaries is not sustainable. It does not protect them, it does not nourish them, it only depletes them. So they begin, gently, to choose themselves, not in a harsh way, not in a way that denies their feelings, but in a way that honors them. They start by pausing before reacting, by asking themselves, is this being reciprocated? Is this healthy for me? Am I giving from a full place or an empty one? And those questions begin to guide them back to themselves. You need to understand how powerful this is, because for the first time, they are no longer focused on fixing the other person. They are focused on listening to themselves. They are no longer chasing clarity from someone else. They are creating clarity within. And that shift, as subtle as it may seem, changes the entire dynamic. Because when a giver stops overgiving, the energy changes. They are no longer available in the same way. They are no longer filling every gap, responding to every silence, excusing every inconsistency. And for someone who has become used to that, especially an avoidant, it can feel unsettling. It can feel like something is missing, like the connection is slipping, like they no longer have the same access they once did. But the giver is not doing this to create a reaction. They are not doing it to punish or to prove a point. They are doing it because they have reached a point where continuing the same pattern would mean losing themselves completely. And that is something they can no longer afford. This is where their power truly begins, not in changing the other person, but in changing how they show up. They begin to understand that their value does not come from how much they give, but from how they are treated in return. They begin to see that love is not about proving their worth. It is about sharing it with someone who recognizes it. And with that understanding, they start to set boundaries, not as walls, but as standards. And yes, it is not easy. There are moments where they miss the connection, where they feel the urge to go back to what is familiar, to give just a little more, to reach out one more time. There are moments where their heart remembers the good and tries to forget the pain, but this time they have something stronger than habit. They have awareness, and that awareness keeps them grounded. It reminds them why they had to change, why they had to choose themselves. Because choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. It is the moment you stop giving your energy to something that is not growing and start investing it in your own peace. It is the moment you realize that you deserve a love that meets you, not one that drains you. It is the moment you stop settling for less than what your heart knows is possible. And when a true giver reaches that point, they do not lose their ability to love, they refine it. They become more intentional, more aware, more selective. They no longer give blindly, they give wisely. They no longer pour into empty spaces. They pour into connections that are mutual, consistent, and real. And that is the shift that changes everything, not just in how others see them, but in how they see themselves, because for the first time, they are not just someone who gives love. They are someone who knows they deserve to receive it too.